The brochure felt slick and cold in my hands when I found it on my kitchen table. Glossy pages showing smiling elderly people in wheelchairs with the words Sunset Gardens Senior Living embossed across the front. My daughter had left it there like a takeout menu, casual as anything, while I'd been out getting groceries. 71 years old, and suddenly I was being disposed of like furniture that didn't match the decor anymore. Let me tell you how family betrayal looks when it comes wrapped in concern, when elder respect becomes a casualty of convenience, when the child you raise decides you're more burden than parent. This isn't just about finding that brochure or discovering my daughter Jennifer's plan to move me into assisted living against my will. This is about inheritance drama that's been brewing for years, about hidden family secrets that finally surfaced, about the moment I realized the house I'd lived in for 43 years was under threat from the person I trusted most in the world. I'm sitting here now in that same kitchen, the morning light coming through the windows I've cleaned 1,000 times, the coffee maker gurgling the way it has every morning since I bought it in 1998, and I'm thinking about how close I came to losing everything. Not just the house, though, that would have been devastating enough, but my independence, my dignity, my right to decide how I spend whatever years I have left on this earth. My name is Robert, though most people call me Bob, and I've been a widower for 8 years now. My wife Clara died of cancer, one of those quick, aggressive kinds that takes someone from diagnosis to gone in less than a year. We'd been married 47 years when she passed, and the grief of it nearly killed me too, honestly. Those first 2 years after, I moved through the house like a ghost, touching her things, sitting in her chair, cooking her recipes, just to feel like she was still somehow present. Jennifer was wonderful during that time, I'll give her that. She'd come over 3 times a week, bring groceries, cook meals, sit with me while I cried, or stared at old photo albums, or just existed in that numb space where grief lives. She helped me sort through Clara's clothes, held my hand at the cemetery, called every night to make sure I was okay. I thought we'd become closer through the loss, bonded by our shared love for the woman who'd held our family together. But something shifted after those first couple years. Subtle at first, then more pronounced. Jennifer started making comments about the house being too big for one person, about the maintenance being too much for someone my age, about how I shouldn't be living alone anymore. I'd brush it off, tell her I was fine, that I'd lived in this house since Jennifer was 3 years old and I wasn't about to leave it now. The house held Clara's memory in every room, every piece of furniture, every mark on the wall where we'd measured Jennifer's height as she grew. It's a good house, too. Solid construction from the early 80s, 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a big backyard where Clara used to garden. Nothing fancy, but paid off entirely about 15 years ago, sitting on a corner lot in a neighborhood that's gotten more valuable as the city expanded around it. Real estate agents leave cards in my mailbox every week wanting to list it, talking about how much houses are going for in this area now, numbers that seem almost obscene compared to what we paid back then. Jennifer knew all this, of course. She'd grown up here, had her bedroom upstairs until she left for college, came back for holidays and Sunday dinners throughout her 20s and 30s. She'd inherited her mother's practical nature, became an accountant like Clara had been, married a man named David who worked in corporate finance, had 2 kids of her own, lived in one of those new suburban developments where all the houses look vaguely the same. And somewhere along the way, she'd started looking at my house not as home, not as the place that held decades of family history, but as an asset, a financial opportunity, something that could be liquidated and redistributed according to her plans for my future. I didn't realize this at first, didn't understand the shift in her attention from my well-being to my real estate holdings. When she started asking about my will, about whether I'd updated it since Clara died, about my financial situation and retirement accounts, I thought she was being responsible, thinking ahead, making sure I had everything in order. I appreciated it, or thought I did, because managing finances alone after Clara died felt overwhelming, and having Jennifer's help seemed like a blessing. But that brochure on the kitchen table, that was the moment everything crystallized into clarity. This wasn't about helping me. This was about controlling me, about moving me out of the way so she could access what she'd apparently decided was rightfully hers, even though I was very much alive and mentally competent, and nowhere near needing the kind of care those glossy brochures promised. The morning I found it, I'd been up since 5:30, like I always am. that internal clock refusing to adjust even though I don't have to be anywhere particular anymore. I'd made my coffee in the old percolator, read the newspaper at the kitchen table like I do every morning, and then headed out to the grocery store, because Tuesday is when they have the senior discount, and old habits die hard when you've been watching your budget for decades. When I got back, arms full of grocery bags, the house had that disturbed feeling you get when someone's been in your space without permission. Nothing obvious, nothing dramatic, just that subtle awareness that things aren't quite how you left them. I put the groceries away, putting the milk in the fridge, the bread in the bread box, the canned goods in the pantry, all those automatic movements you don't even think about after doing them thousands of times. That's when I saw the brochure, positioned prominently on the table where I'd been sitting just an hour before, reading my newspaper and drinking my coffee in peaceful solitude. Sunset Gardens Senior Living, with its happy elderly people and its promises of community and care and dignity in your golden years. I picked it up, and there was a sticky note in Jennifer's handwriting. "Dad, let's talk about this tonight. I'll come by around 6. My first emotion was confusion. Why would Jennifer be leaving me information about senior living facilities? I was managing fine on my own, paying my bills, keeping the house clean enough, cooking my meals, driving to the store and the doctor and anywhere else I needed to go. I had my weekly poker game with the guys from my old work, my volunteer shift at the library on Thursdays, my routine that kept me busy and purposeful. Then the confusion shifted to something else, something darker and more unsettling. This wasn't a suggestion. The way the brochure was positioned, the tone of that sticky note, the assumption that we'd be talking about it rather than whether we'd talk about it, it felt like a decision already made, a plan already in motion. I was just being informed, not consulted. I spent the rest of that day reading through the brochure, really reading it, trying to understand what Jennifer was thinking. Sunset Gardens looked nice enough, if you like that sort of thing. Communal dining rooms, scheduled activities, medical staff on site, different levels of care depending on your needs, independent living apartments, assisted living units, memory care facilities for those dealing with dementia. But I didn't need any of that. I was 71, not 91. I was healthy except for the usual aches and pains that come with age, my blood pressure controlled by medication, my cholesterol managed, my mind sharp and clear. I didn't need help bathing or dressing or remembering to take my pills. I didn't need supervision or structured activities or someone deciding when I ate dinner and what I ate for it. What I needed was to be left alone in my own house, living my own life, making my own choices about how I spent my days and my money and my remaining years. But apparently, Jennifer had other ideas. She showed up right at 6 like her note said, letting herself in with the key I'd given her years ago for emergencies. She had paperwork with her, I noticed, a folder tucked under her arm along with her purse, and her expression was that determined one she'd get as a child when she'd decided on something and wasn't going to be budged. Clara used to call it her stubborn face, said she'd inherited it from my side of the family, though I always thought she got it from her mother. We sat in the living room, Jennifer on the couch where she used to do homework as a teenager, me in my recliner that's molded to my shape after 15 years of daily use. The evening light was coming through the windows, catching dust motes in the air, and I remember thinking how normal everything looked, how domestic and calm, even though I could feel the tension building like a storm approaching. Jennifer started with the soft approach, telling me she'd been worried about me, that the house was getting to be too much, that she'd noticed I wasn't keeping up with things the way I used to. The gutters needed cleaning, she said, and there were weeds in the backyard. And hadn't I mentioned my back was hurting from mowing the lawn? Wouldn't it be easier? Wouldn't I be happier if I didn't have to worry about all that maintenance? If I could live somewhere where everything was taken care of for me? I listened to all this, letting her build her case, watching her sell me on the idea of giving up my independence like it was a vacation package she'd found a great deal on. And I felt anger building in my chest. That slow, burning kind that comes from being patronized, from being treated like a child who can't make decisions for themselves. But I didn't interrupt. I wanted to hear the whole pitch, wanted to understand exactly what she thought was happening here. So I sat in my recliner, hands folded in my lap, face neutral, and let her talk. She showed me the paperwork, brochures from 3 different facilities, not just Sunset Gardens. She'd done research, she said, compared prices and amenities and care levels. She'd even gone on tours, talked to staff, collected information packets. This wasn't a spontaneous idea. This had been planned, investigated, decided upon, without any input from me whatsoever. Then came the financial argument, the real reason under all the concern about my well-being. She said the house was worth a lot of money now, that I was sitting on a valuable asset that was just going to require more and more maintenance as it aged. If I sold it, moved into one of these facilities, I'd have plenty of money to cover the monthly fees and still have a substantial amount left over. For my care, she said, for making sure I was comfortable and safe as I got older. And here's where she revealed her real hand, the part she probably thought she was being subtle about. She said she'd been talking to David, her husband, and they'd been looking at the numbers, and they thought it would make sense for me to consider transferring the house title to her before selling it for tax purposes. There were estate planning advantages, she said, ways to minimize the tax burden, strategies her husband had learned about through his work in finance. She said all this like she was doing me a favor, like she'd discovered some clever loophole that would benefit everyone. But what I heard was my daughter asking me to sign over my house to her so she could sell it and control the money, while I moved into assisted living and lost any claim to the home I'd built my life in. That's when I knew this wasn't about my well-being at all. This was about inheritance drama, about Jennifer deciding she'd rather have her inheritance now, while she could use it for her own life, rather than waiting until I died and dealing with estate issues then. And she was willing to package it as concern for my care, willing to manipulate me with worry about maintenance and safety, willing to upend my entire life for her financial convenience. But little did she know what I'd already set in motion, what I'd been preparing for months before that brochure ever appeared on my kitchen table. See, I'm not as oblivious as my daughter apparently thought. I'd noticed the shift in her attention, the increased interest in my finances, the casual questions about my will and my property that had become less casual over time, and I'd started making plans, quietly and carefully, because I'd learned something important during my 71 years on this earth. Hope for the best, but prepare for the worst, especially when it comes to money and family. About 6 months before Jennifer left that brochure, I'd met with my lawyer, a man named Harold who'd handled our real estate closing when we bought the house, who'd written our wills when Jennifer was born, who'd known our family for over 40 years. I'd told him about Jennifer's increasing interest in my property, about my concerns that she might try to push me into a situation I didn't want, about needing to protect myself and my autonomy. Harold had listened with that grave attention lawyers give to serious matters, and then he'd laid out some options for me. We could set up a trust, he said, or we could transfer the deed into a different ownership structure, or we could create legal protections that would prevent anyone from forcing me out of my home or accessing my assets without my explicit consent. We'd gone with a combination approach, something elegant and legally bulletproof. I'd transferred the house into a life estate deed, which meant I retained the right to live in it until I died. But the remainder interest passed to a trust I'd created. The trust was set up to benefit Jennifer eventually, but only after my death, and only with stipulations about how the proceeds could be used. I'd named Harold as the trustee, someone I trusted to follow my wishes rather than Jennifer's convenience. The beauty of this arrangement was that Jennifer couldn't force me to sell, couldn't access the asset while I was alive, couldn't pressure me into signing anything over to her because I'd already protected it beyond her reach. The house was still mine to live in, still my home in every way that mattered, but legally structured in a way that prevented exactly what Jennifer was trying to do. I hadn't told her about this. I'd wanted to see what she'd do, wanted to understand if my suspicions about her motivations were accurate or if I was being paranoid in my old age. That brochure, that conversation, that pitch about transferring the title for tax purposes, it confirmed everything I'd worried about. My daughter was willing to manipulate me, to lie to me about her reasons, to package greed as concern. So when she finished her presentation about Sunset Gardens and tax strategies, and wouldn't it be so much easier, I sat back in my recliner, the leather creaking under my weight, and I asked her a simple question. Did she think I was senile? Did she think I didn't understand what she was really asking for? Jennifer's face went through several expressions very quickly, confusion giving way to defensiveness, the caught-out look of someone who realizes their manipulation has been spotted. She started to protest, to insist that's not what this was about, that she was genuinely worried about me, that this was all for my benefit, but I wasn't having it. Not anymore. I told her I knew exactly what this was about, that I'd seen it coming for months, that I wasn't the confused old man she apparently thought I was. I told her I had no intention of moving into any senior living facility, that I was perfectly capable of living in my own home, and that if and when that changed, I'd make that decision for myself, not have it made for me by a daughter more interested in real estate values than her father's happiness. Then I told her about the life estate deed, about the trust, about the legal protections I'd put in place. I told her the house was no longer accessible to her schemes, that she couldn't force me to sell it or sign it over or move out of it, that I'd made sure my autonomy was protected by more than just my ability to say no. The look on Jennifer's face was something I'll remember for the rest of my life, a mixture of shock and anger and embarrassment. She tried to argue, said I was being unreasonable, that she was just trying to help, that I was making a mistake by refusing her assistance. But underneath all that, I could see the frustration of someone whose careful plans had just fallen apart, whose financial strategy had hit an immovable obstacle. She left angry, said some things I won't repeat about me being stubborn and difficult, about how I'd regret this when I couldn't manage on my own anymore, about how she was done trying to help someone who wouldn't accept help. She grabbed her folder of brochures and paperwork and walked out, letting the screen door slam behind her in a way that reminded me of her teenage years when she'd stomped to her room after we'd argued about curfew or homework or boys. I sat in my recliner for a long time after she left, watching the sun finish setting through the living room windows, feeling a complicated mix of relief and sadness. Relief that I'd protected myself, that my home was safe, that I wouldn't be forced into a situation I didn't want, but sadness too, deep and aching. Because this was my daughter, the baby girl I'd held in the hospital, the child I'd raised and loved and thought I knew. And she'd been willing to manipulate me, to package self-interest as concern, to disrupt my entire life for her financial benefit. The house felt very quiet after she left, just the ticking of that old clock in the hallway, the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen, the creaking of old wood settling in the evening temperature change. These were the sounds of my life. The acoustic backdrop of 4 decades lived in these rooms, and I felt grateful I'd fought to keep them, to keep this space that held so much history and meaning. But I also felt lonely in a way I hadn't since Clara died. Because losing your spouse is one kind of grief, but discovering your child's betrayal is another kind entirely, sharp and bitter and complicated by all the love that doesn't disappear just because trust has been broken. The next few weeks were tense and difficult. Jennifer didn't call, didn't come by, maintained that angry silence that was probably meant to punish me for refusing her plans, but mostly just confirmed that her concern had been performative rather than genuine. My grandkids, her children, stopped coming around too, and I wondered what she'd told them, what version of events she'd spun to make me the villain in this story. I kept to my routine, though it felt hollow with that family conflict hanging over everything. Tuesday grocery runs, Wednesday poker games, Thursday library shifts, Friday coffee with my neighbor Tom, weekends working in the yard, or reading, or just existing in the space I'd fought to protect. The house that had felt like sanctuary started to feel like fortress, necessary protection, but also isolation. Then came the phone calls, first from Jennifer's husband David, trying a different approach, more aggressive and openly frustrated. He called me stubborn, said I was making things difficult for everyone, that Jennifer had only been trying to help and I'd thrown it back in her face. He talked about financial responsibility, about making smart decisions, about how I was being selfish by sitting on a valuable asset instead of liquidating it and planning for future care needs. I listened to him rant for about 5 minutes and then I hung up. I didn't owe him explanations. He wasn't family in any way that mattered, just someone who'd married into it and apparently thought that gave him authority over my life choices. He called back twice more, and both times I let it go to voicemail, deleted the messages without listening to them. Then my sister Marie called, Jennifer's aunt, someone I'd been close to my whole life. Marie was 5 years younger than me, still working part-time at the accounting firm where she'd spent her whole career, sharp as ever and not prone to nonsense. She'd heard about the situation from Jennifer, she said, and she wanted to make sure I was okay. I told her everything. The whole story, from the brochure to the legal protections to Jennifer's angry exit. Marie listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she sighed in that heavy way that says she'd suspected something like this was coming. She told me Jennifer had been asking her questions too, months ago, about estate planning and property values and tax strategies. Marie had assumed Jennifer was asking for general information, maybe helping a client, but now it made sense. Jennifer had been building her strategy, researching her approach, getting her ducks in a row before making her move. And Marie, being the ethical accountant she was, hadn't connected the dots until it was too late to warn me. But Marie also told me something else, something that made the whole situation even more complicated. Jennifer and David were having money troubles, had been for a couple years now. David's company had gone through layoffs and restructuring, and while he'd kept his job, his salary had been cut significantly. They'd overextended themselves buying a house they couldn't really afford in that expensive new development, and they had 2 kids approaching college age with the tuition costs that entailed. They needed money, Marie said, and they'd apparently decided my house was the solution to their financial problems. Jennifer had convinced herself she was killing 2 birds with 1 stone, solving their money issues while also, in her mind, taking care of her aging father. Never mind that her aging father didn't need or want that kind of taking care of. This information shifted something in my understanding of the situation, added context without excusing behavior. Jennifer wasn't just being greedy, she was desperate. And desperate people make choices they might not otherwise make, justify actions they'd normally recognize as wrong. It didn't make what she'd done acceptable, but it made it more comprehensible, more human somehow. Marie suggested I reach out to Jennifer, try to mend fences, find some middle ground. But I wasn't ready for that yet. Wasn't ready to pretend everything was fine when trust had been so thoroughly broken. And I wasn't about to reward manipulation with reconciliation. Wasn't about to teach Jennifer that, if she pushed hard enough and made me feel guilty enough, she'd get what she wanted. So I maintained my silence, let time pass, focused on living my life and managing my house and preserving my autonomy. And slowly, gradually, something unexpected started to happen. I started feeling better, stronger, more confident in my decisions than I had in years. Living alone after Clara died had made me vulnerable in ways I hadn't fully recognized, dependent on Jennifer's validation and involvement in ways that weren't healthy for either of us. I'd been so grateful for her help during my grief that I'd stopped seeing clearly, stopped recognizing when help became control, when concern became manipulation. But now, with boundaries firmly established and my autonomy protected, I was rediscovering the person I'd been before grief made me small and dependent. I was capable, I was competent, I was perfectly able to manage my own life and make my own decisions. And more importantly, I deserved to live on my own terms, in my own house, for however many years I had left. About 2 months after that confrontation, something shifted again. Jennifer sent a text message, brief and careful, saying she'd like to talk if I was willing. Not demanding, not manipulating, just asking. I sat with that message for a couple days, weighing whether I was ready for conversation, whether enough time had passed for wounds to scab over, if not fully heal. Finally, I replied. Said she could come by, keep it short, just talk without agendas or paperwork or schemes. She agreed, and we set a date for the following Sunday afternoon, neutral territory in terms of time. No meal involved to make things more complicated. She showed up on time, looking tired and older somehow, stress written in the lines around her eyes and the tension in her shoulders. We sat in the same spots, her on the couch, me in my recliner, the afternoon light different from that evening 2 months earlier, but the space holding the same weight of complicated history. Jennifer apologized, and it seemed genuine this time, lacking the defensive edge of that first confrontation. She said she'd been desperate, that money problems had clouded her judgment, that she'd convinced herself she was helping me when really she'd been helping herself. She said she was ashamed of how she'd behaved, of the manipulation and the assumptions and the disrespect she'd shown for my autonomy. She didn't ask me to reverse the life estate deed, didn't try to resurrect her plans, just acknowledged she'd been wrong and hoped we could find a way to repair our relationship. She talked about missing me, about her kids asking why they didn't see Grandpa anymore, about realizing that money wasn't worth destroying family over. I listened to all this, watching her face, trying to gauge sincerity versus strategy. And I saw something I hadn't seen in years, vulnerability and genuine remorse. My daughter, rather than the calculating person she'd become under financial pressure. So I made a decision, one I'd been considering since Marie's phone call, since understanding the desperation driving Jennifer's behavior. I told Jennifer I forgave her, but forgiveness didn't mean forgetting, didn't mean pretending it hadn't happened or going back to how things were before. I told her the life estate deed was staying in place, the legal protections weren't being reversed, because trust once broken takes years to rebuild, and I wasn't gambling my autonomy on good intentions. But I also told her that if she and David were having money troubles, there were other ways I could help, ways that didn't involve giving up my home or my independence. I had some savings, modest but real, money I'd been keeping for emergencies or unexpected expenses. I could make a loan, not a gift, a loan with clear terms and expectations about repayment, something that would help them through this tight spot without enabling the behavior that led to it. Jennifer cried, which wasn't something she did often, had inherited Clara's stoic approach to emotion, along with so much else. She said she couldn't accept a loan, that she'd already done enough damage, that she didn't deserve my help after what she'd tried to do. But I told her this wasn't about deserving. It was about family, about helping when you can while maintaining boundaries that protect everyone involved. We worked it out over the following weeks, with Harold drawing up proper loan documents, making everything legal and clear. I lent them $50,000, enough to consolidate some high-interest debt and give them breathing room to sort out their finances without desperation driving their decisions. They'd pay me back over 5 years with modest interest, terms that were fair without being punishing. And gradually, carefully, we started rebuilding our relationship. Jennifer came by for Sunday dinners again, bringing the grandkids, but the dynamic had changed in ways that were actually healthier. She didn't let herself in with her key anymore, knocked and waited for me to answer. She asked about my plans rather than making assumptions about what I could or couldn't handle. She treated me like an adult, like someone with agency and autonomy, rather than like a problem to be managed. The grandkids, who'd missed those Sunday visits more than they'd probably admit, fell back into the old routines. My grandson Jake, 14 now, and all teenage awkwardness, would help me with yard work while we talked about school and girls and whatever else was on his mind. My granddaughter Emma, 11 and sharp as a tack, would sit at the kitchen table doing homework while I cooked dinner, asking me questions about history or science, or sometimes just telling me about her day. Those Sunday dinners became sacred again, but different from before. There was an honesty now that hadn't existed when everything was buried under assumption and unspoken expectation. We could talk about difficult things, about money and aging and family dynamics, without it escalating into manipulation or resentment. We'd been forced into clarity by crisis, and while I wouldn't have chosen that path, the destination was worth the difficulty of getting there. David even apologized eventually, came by one evening without Jennifer, man to man, and admitted he'd pushed her into a course of action he now regretted. He'd been panicking about their financial situation, he said, had convinced himself that tapping into what he saw as a sitting asset was reasonable planning rather than manipulation. He could see now that he'd been wrong, that his desperation had made him rationalize behavior he wouldn't normally condone. I appreciated the apology, accepted it with the same cautious forgiveness I'd extended to Jennifer. David wasn't a bad man, just someone who'd made bad choices under pressure, who'd let financial stress override ethical judgment. We wouldn't be close, probably would never be, but we could coexist at family dinners without tension, could treat each other with the basic respect that makes family gatherings bearable, if not always comfortable. The house that had been under threat, that I'd had to legally protect from my own daughter, settled back into being home rather than fortress. I could walk through the rooms without that hyper-vigilant awareness of vulnerability, could sit on my porch watching the neighborhood without wondering when the next challenge to my autonomy would come. The life estate deed was still in place, the trust still intact, but they'd receded into background protection rather than active defense. I kept up with my routines, the Tuesday grocery runs and Wednesday poker games and Thursday library shifts, all the small rituals that give structure to days that might otherwise blur together in retirement. But I added some new elements too, things I'd been reluctant to try when I felt vulnerable and dependent on Jennifer's approval. I joined a senior center program, not for assisted living, but for community, for classes and activities and social connection with people my own age. I took a cooking class, learned some new techniques to vary my dinner rotation beyond the same dozen meals I'd been cycling through since Clara died. I joined a book club that met every other Friday, discovered I actually enjoyed discussing literature with strangers who became friends over shared interpretations of complicated novels. I even started dating, sort of. Nothing serious but coffee or lunch with a widow named Patricia I'd met at the senior center. We'd both lost spouses to cancer, both been through the grief and adjustment of living alone after decades of partnership. Both were wary of anything serious, but enjoyed having someone to talk to who understood what that loss felt like. Sometimes shared experience is its own kind of intimacy, doesn't require romance to be meaningful. Life, in other words, continued and even improved, shaped by the crisis I'd navigated but not defined by it. I was still living in my house, still independent and autonomous, still making my own choices about how I spent my days and my money and my energy. But I was also more engaged with life beyond these walls, more connected to community, more open to experiences I might have declined when I was wrapped in protective isolation. Jennifer noticed the changes, commented on how much happier I seemed, how good it was to see me building a life beyond just existing in the house with memories. And she was right. I was happier, had found a balance between honoring Clara's memory and moving forward into whatever comes next. The house held our history, but it wasn't a museum anymore, wasn't a shrine to the past. It was a living space, filled with my current life, and that felt right in a way it hadn't for years. About a year after that initial confrontation, Jennifer and David sold their expensive house in the new development, bought something smaller and more affordable, made the practical choice they should have made from the start instead of trying to extract it from my circumstances. They were managing their finances more carefully, living within their means rather than trying to project an image of success they couldn't sustain. And they seemed happier for it, less stressed, more present with their kids and their lives. We'd all learned something from the crisis. Different lessons but complementary ones. Jennifer learned that financial desperation doesn't justify manipulation. That family isn't a resource to be exploited when times get tough. That respect and autonomy matter more than convenience or inheritance. David learned similar lessons, plus the additional one that enabling your spouse's worst impulses helps no one. That sometimes the supportive thing is to say no, this isn't right, we need to find another way. And I learned that protecting yourself doesn't mean you can't forgive, that boundaries and compassion can coexist, that you can maintain your autonomy while still being part of family. I learned that age doesn't require surrender, that being 71 doesn't mean accepting other people's decisions about your life, that independence is worth fighting for even when the fight comes from unexpected directions. The life estate deed stayed in place, my protection and my statement. I'd probably never need it again. Probably Jennifer had learned her lesson and wouldn't try anything similar. But having it there, knowing my home was legally secured beyond anyone's ability to force me out, it gave me peace of mind that was worth more than any amount of money. Harold, my lawyer, had become more than just legal counsel through all this, had become a friend in the way that sometimes happens when someone helps you through crisis. We'd have lunch every month or so, talking about everything and nothing, sometimes law and property and estate planning, but more often books and politics and the random observations of men who'd lived long enough to have perspective on how strange and complicated life can get. He told me once that what I'd done, protecting my autonomy before it was threatened, rather than scrambling to protect it during crisis, that was wisdom more of his clients should exercise. Too many people wait, he said, wait until they're vulnerable, or sick, or scared, and then they try to set up protections when they're least equipped to make clear decisions. I'd been smart to act while I was still strong, still clear-headed, still able to plan for worst-case scenarios before they became immediate threats. I didn't feel particularly wise, still don't, just cautious and perhaps a bit cynical about how money changes people, how financial pressure reveals character in ways that comfort never does. But I was grateful I'd trusted my instincts, grateful I'd taken action when the warning signs appeared, rather than dismissing them as paranoia or age-related anxiety. The poker games on Wednesdays became more meaningful after everything happened. Those few hours with men I'd known for decades, playing cards and talking trash, and occasionally having real conversations about aging and family and the complicated business of trying to maintain dignity when the world keeps trying to diminish you. Most of them had their own stories, their own family complications, their own struggles with adult children who saw them as problems to be solved rather than people to be respected. We'd trade war stories sometimes, comparing notes on nursing home pressure and financial manipulation, and the thousand small indignities of being older in a culture that worships youth. And we'd offer each other advice, strategies for maintaining autonomy, recommendations for lawyers and financial advisors, solidarity in the shared experience of being dismissed because of age. One of the guys, Tom, had a similar situation with his son, trying to get power of attorney under false pretenses, claiming Tom wasn't capable of managing his affairs when really the son wanted access to Tom's retirement accounts. Tom had fought it, gotten his own lawyer, maintained control of his finances, but the relationship with his son was permanently damaged, worse than mine with Jennifer, because Tom's son hadn't apologized, hadn't acknowledged wrongdoing, had just gotten angry at being thwarted. Hearing Tom's story made me appreciate Jennifer's eventual honesty, her willingness to admit she'd been wrong and work to repair what she'd damaged. Not everyone gets that opportunity. Not every family crisis ends with reconciliation, even partial reconciliation. Some betrayals are permanent. Some relationships can't be rebuilt, and maintaining your autonomy sometimes means accepting loneliness as the price of self-respect. I was lucky, in a strange way, that Jennifer's conscience had eventually kicked in, that she'd been capable of shame and growth rather than just bitterness at being outmaneuvered. Not everyone is. Not everyone has that capacity for self-reflection and change. And I'd been prepared for the possibility that our relationship might not survive, that protecting my autonomy might mean losing my daughter permanently, that I was willing to pay that price, painful as it would have been, that told me something important about my own growth, my own understanding of what mattered most. The library shifts on Thursdays took on new meaning too, that volunteer work becoming more than just a way to fill time. I was helping people, mostly older folks who came in needing assistance with computers or looking for large print books or just wanting someone to talk to. And I understood them in ways I might not have before my own crisis, understood the vulnerability of aging, the fear of being shuffled aside, the determination to maintain independence as long as possible. There was one regular, a woman named Dorothy, who came in every Thursday afternoon, always checking out mysteries, always stopping to chat about what she'd read the previous week. She lived alone, too, widowed like me, and she'd mentioned once that her daughter kept suggesting she move closer, move into her daughter's basement apartment where she could be looked after. Dorothy wasn't having it, valued her independence too much, didn't want to become a dependent burden on her kid's life. I told her about the life estate deed, about legal protections for autonomy, about making sure she had documents in place that would prevent anyone from forcing her into situations she didn't want. She listened intently, took notes, asked smart questions, and a few weeks later she came in and told me she'd met with a lawyer, set up her own protections, felt safer knowing she couldn't be manipulated out of her home. That felt good, helping someone else avoid what I'd been through, passing along hard-won knowledge that might spare others the same crisis. And it gave purpose to what had happened, turned my experience from just personal pain into something that could benefit others, into a kind of teaching moment about elder rights and autonomy protection. The senior center classes introduced me to perspectives I hadn't considered, other people dealing with their own versions of family complications. There was a grief support group I attended for a while, working through lingering sadness about Clara, about Jennifer's betrayal, about the ways life disappoints even when it also delivers small, unexpected joys. And there was a legal rights workshop that covered elder law, powers of attorney, guardianship issues, all the mechanisms that can protect or threaten autonomy depending on how they're used. I learned that what Jennifer had tried to do, while hurtful and manipulative, wasn't unusual. Family members trying to access elder assets, trying to force living situation changes, trying to take control under the guise of concern. It happens constantly, epidemic levels according to the elder law attorney who ran the workshop. And most elderly people don't protect themselves in advance, don't see it coming until it's already happening, don't have the resources or knowledge to fight back effectively. That made me both sad and angry, sad for all the people losing their autonomy and homes and dignity because they trusted the wrong people, angry at a system that makes it so easy to manipulate and control elderly family members in the name of care. But it also made me more committed to sharing what I'd learned, to being vocal about elder rights, to helping others protect themselves before crisis strikes. I started speaking at the senior center occasionally. informal talks about estate planning and legal protections, and recognizing warning signs of financial exploitation. Nothing fancy, just an old man sharing his story. But people listened, took notes, asked questions, thanked me afterwards for information they didn't know they needed. And that felt like taking something painful and turning it into something useful, like redemption of a sort. Jennifer would come to some of these talks sometimes, sitting in the back, listening to me tell sanitized versions of our story without naming names. Afterwards, she'd tell me she was proud of me, that what I was doing mattered, that she hoped her mistake could help prevent others from making similar choices. It was generous of her, showing up to hear me discuss our family drama in educational context, but I appreciated the gesture, appreciated her willingness to support my work, even when it meant confronting her own past behavior. The grandkids were getting older, Jake approaching college now, Emma deep in middle school social dynamics. They'd ask me sometimes about getting older, about how to know when someone needed help versus when they just needed space, about the balance between caring for family and respecting their autonomy. Heavy questions for teenagers, but they'd lived through our family crisis, watched it unfold, and they were trying to process what it meant, what they should learn from it. I told them the same things I told audiences at the senior center, about respect being fundamental, about listening to what people want rather than assuming you know better, about understanding that age doesn't eliminate the right to self-determination. I told them that caring for someone doesn't mean controlling them, that help should be offered, not imposed, that the kindest thing you can do for aging family is honor their choices even when you disagree with them. They listened in that serious way young people do when they're trying to understand complicated adult situations, and I hoped they'd remember these conversations when they were older, when they were dealing with their own aging parents, when they might be tempted to make decisions for others rather than with them. If my crisis could teach them those lessons early, could help them avoid repeating Jennifer's mistakes, then maybe something good would come from all the pain. The house continued to need maintenance, of course, because houses do, because that's the nature of ownership and time and things gradually wearing out. But I managed it, hired help when needed, kept up with repairs and upkeep, proved to myself and anyone watching that I was perfectly capable of maintaining my home and my independence. The gutters got cleaned, the lawn got mowed, the weeds got pulled, all the things Jennifer had pointed to as evidence I couldn't manage anymore. And yes, it was harder than it used to be, required more rest breaks and careful planning and occasional professional assistance. But harder doesn't mean impossible, doesn't mean incompetent, doesn't justify being forced into institutional living. I was managing, doing fine, living my life on my terms, and that was what mattered. Patricia, the woman I'd been seeing casually for coffee and lunch, gradually became more present in my life, not romantically exactly, but as companion and friend. We'd go to movies together, try new restaurants, take walks through parks, all the simple pleasures of shared experience. She understood without me having to explain that I wasn't looking to replace Clara, wasn't trying to recreate what I'd had, was just enjoying present company, without demanding it become something more. She had her own house, her own autonomy she was protecting, her own wariness about letting someone new have too much influence over her life and choices. We were good together precisely because we both understood boundaries, both valued independence, both were old enough to know that companionship doesn't require cohabitation or commitment, can just be what it is without demanding it become something else. Jennifer liked Patricia, which pleased me more than it probably should have. They'd chat at Sunday dinners sometimes, talking about books or recipes or grandkid stories, finding their own connection independent of me. And I appreciated that Jennifer could be happy for me having companionship, could support this new development in my life without feeling threatened by it or trying to control it. 2 years after that initial confrontation, Jennifer and David had finished paying back the loan, every payment on time, no drama or excuses or requests for extensions. The money went back into my savings, plus the modest interest we'd agreed on, and I felt satisfied with how that had worked out. I'd helped family when they needed it, but on terms that protected everyone involved, with clear boundaries and expectations that had been met. When the final payment cleared, Jennifer came by with a bottle of good wine, something she knew I liked, and we toasted to complicated family relationships and hard lessons learned and the possibility of moving forward without resentment weighing everything down. It felt ceremonial, marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of whatever came next, acknowledging growth and forgiveness without pretending the past hadn't happened. She thanked me again, not just for the loan, but for handling everything with more grace than she deserved, for being willing to rebuild relationship despite how badly she'd damaged it, for teaching her about boundaries and respect and the difference between helping and controlling. And I thanked her too, strange as that might sound, for forcing me to protect myself, to rediscover my strength, to stop being passively dependent on her validation and approval. We'd both grown through the crisis, learned things about ourselves and each other that we might not have learned otherwise. Not the way anyone would choose to learn, not a process I'd recommend, but valuable nonetheless. And we were closer now, paradoxically, than we'd been before, when our relationship was built on unspoken assumptions and unexpressed needs. Crisis had forced honesty. Honesty had enabled healing, and healing had created something more authentic than what we'd had before. The life estate deed remained in place, my insurance policy, my statement that boundaries matter even in repaired relationships. Jennifer understood why, didn't push for me to reverse it, respected that trust rebuilds slowly and some protections need to stay permanent. And I appreciated that understanding, that acceptance that she'd damaged something fundamental and couldn't just apologize it away. Harold, my lawyer, retired eventually, passed the practice to a younger partner but stayed in touch, those monthly lunches continuing because friendship doesn't require professional relationship to sustain it. He told me he used my case as an example sometimes, teaching younger lawyers about the importance of advance planning, about protecting clients before crisis rather than scrambling during emergency. He'd changed identifying details, made it generic, but the core story, protecting autonomy from family pressure through legal structure, that became part of his teaching legacy. I felt honored by that, knowing my experience might help other elderly people protect themselves, might train lawyers to recognize warning signs and suggest preventive measures, my personal pain becoming educational tool, my crisis serving broader purpose that gave meaning to what had been just personal betrayal. The poker games continued every Wednesday, that ritual remaining constant through everything else changing. Some of the original guys died, heart attacks or cancer or just old age, and we'd attend funerals and comfort widows and fill the empty chairs with new members. But the core remained, men gathering to play cards and tell stories and maintain connection through the isolating experience of aging. We'd celebrated 70th birthdays and 75ths, watched each other slow down and gray further, and adapt to various health issues. We'd shared victories and losses, grandkid stories and medical updates, the mundane details of lives being lived day by day, and we'd supported each other through family crises, relationship struggles, all the complications that come with having people you love who don't always behave lovably. They'd been there for me through everything with Jennifer, listening without judgment, offering advice when asked, just bearing witness to the difficulty of navigating betrayal while maintaining family connection. And I'd been there for them through their own struggles, returning the favor, providing the solidarity that comes from shared experience and mutual respect. Tom, whose son had tried to steal power of attorney, eventually reconciled with his kid too, years later, after the son hit bottom financially, and learned some hard lessons about responsibility and consequences. It wasn't the same relationship they'd had before, couldn't be, but they'd found a careful peace, maintained connection around Tom's gran.